So I haven't always been the nicest to Game of Thrones, but it truly is like an old passionate relationship that just ended in a way that I never would have thought possible. And if I'm being honest with myself, I haven't moved on, and I still love Game of Thrones. And yeah, I still hated the ending, and I have found so many problems in the last few seasons that really felt like a total disconnect from the quality of storytelling that I initially fell in love with. But here's the thing, I still watch Game of Thrones. And I don't mean I go back and watch my favorite episodes or seasons. I mean, I still go back and watch the whole series over again, at least once a year. Even season 8. Knowing that so many of my favorite characters would feel like they betrayed their character arcs, or that certain elements that felt foreshadowed are never delivered. Like a true exploration of prophecy, the impact of Jon Snow not being a bastard, Arya abandoning her face-changing abilities, Bran's time-traveling ability, and after season 4, Littlefinger completely forgot that he's the best schemer in all of Game of Thrones, and various other issues or disagreements I have with the last few seasons as the show became more and more detached from the source material in the books written by George R. R. Martin. But I still watch it. Now I'm sure you all have other favorite shows, and I do too. I love The Sopranos, I love Mad Men. I know plenty of people really like Breaking Bad. I hear good things about Succession, and there's plenty of shows like Ozark or something like that on Netflix that comes and goes. I really think that Breaking Bad is a great example that demonstrates from start to finish some of the best quality television that you can possibly imagine, and in that regard, it's objectively better than Game of Thrones, and it certainly avoided bitterly disappointing its fans. But I compare Game of Thrones to a show like Breaking Bad or whatever drama you prefer, even though it seems like it'd be better compared to Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, or the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And yeah, Game of Thrones reached greater heights than Breaking Bad as far as commercial success, but when Game of Thrones first began, the intentional lack of fantasy elements allowed these characters to all feel much more grounded. It gave the characters time to breathe. Arya and Sansa began as total opposites, and yet we can all recognize Arya as a tomboy who doesn't fit in with traditional feminine archetypes, and Sansa is your typical bratty sister who literally aspires to be a princess. Ned is a traditional father, Jon is the outcast half-brother, Catelyn is a typical concerned mother, but then she holds her resentment towards Jon Snow because he's the result of an affair her husband had when he went to the war. These are not fantastical elements. This is all very familiar and fairly relatable outside of the medieval setting. I compare Game of Thrones to dramas because that's what it was, and in that regard, it's much more similar to Breaking Bad than The Avengers or Star Wars. Like when you follow a character like Walter White or Jesse Pinkman, the more in-depth you got with those characters into the heights of a drug empire, there were always scenes at home with Walter and his family, or Jesse in relationships with a couple girlfriends. These moments really contrasted how in over their heads they really were, and how easily they could become overwhelmed by the criminal empire they were falling deeper and deeper into. Game of Thrones does this same thing by introducing Ned Stark as just someone fulfilling duty and prioritizing his honor. His goal is simple once he goes to King's Landing: find out who killed the former Hand of the King, Jon Arryn, and find out why they did it. But the further into the investigation he gets, the more in over his head he gets. And yet, we keep getting these small scenes with him and his children to remind us of the humble beginnings to our story that contrast the new extreme circumstances. There's something about the up-close and personal interactions with the cruelty in Game of Thrones that is actually really grounded but dangerous, that we know not one single character is truly safe. And not just that they could be killed off at any time, but that they'd be tormented in a way that gives your audience this surreal connection to a character's hopelessness. In the first 4 seasons, the scenes that always felt pivotal were either a death or just simple conversations. The nuance of characters allowed the truly villainous ones to jump out from the screen like Ramsay and Joffrey. Game of Thrones handled tension so well with these characters that offering the visuals, it actually added an element of dread that I never really got from reading the books. Joffrey's cruel bullying and abuse is magnified during his wedding as he antagonizes Tyrion. That scene built up so much tension and dread, you could feel the discomfort from every other character. It just kept building and building that you were relieved when Marjorie breaks the tension and the wedding pie is brought out. The scene where Ramsay has Theon shave his beard is another moment that I look at that is so tense and deliberately cruel, and yet there's no action, nor is there need for it, but it still got an audience on the edge of their seat. And yet, these scenes are mostly absent in the later seasons, and since this is a love letter, I don't want to focus on what all went wrong, but I guess I haven't totally healed. Now, with that said, I do still watch the later seasons, and I think it has a lot to do with the investment that is put into the characters early on in the series that allows us to still be very interested in where these characters are going to go, even if they're not being layered quite as much as they were before. And even if the substance felt diluted in the later seasons, we still got tons of payoff. Although it may have felt like cheap fan service, it must have still struck a nerve with some audiences. I can say that the show began to go downhill after season 4, but the ratings really pushed back on that narrative. From my perspective, the worse the writing, the better the ratings, and that's part of the phenomenon, I suppose. A lot of people came into Game of Thrones after streaming the first few seasons, if not more, to catch up with what everyone was talking about. So once they established that investment, and even if they noticed a change in quality to the writing, it was too late. They were already hooked. I read some comments of people that say they stopped watching after a certain moment because it was too different or a character felt butchered, etc., making book comparisons and so on, but I don't know if I believe these fans. Maybe they're telling the truth, maybe they're not, but I'll never know, and they will, but I don't believe them. For me, when Jaime and Bran go to Dorne, that's a difficult area for me to get past, but in Season 5, there's still so much I really enjoy. Hardhome is a fan favorite, but at the Wall, one of my favorite scenes is when Jon beheads Janos Slynt. There's a lot of build up there, there's a lot of confrontation, there's a lot of thinking, how will this actually play out, and then we actually get it to play out maybe a little bit differently than we had initially expected, unless you read the books, of course. And again in Season 6, when Jon executes those that betrayed him, this is one of those areas that Game of Thrones still maintained its nuance. I understand that by the standards of Westeros, these executions are considered lawful, but it's certainly a conflict of my own moral compass, which then helps me maintain a complex relationship with my favorite characters. Jaime in Season 6 is still a good example of feeling perplexed by a character's actions. He still loves Cersei, and I disagree with this personally, but enjoy it for his character development in the show. And even though one of my biggest frustrations is leaving out Lady Stoneheart, which I believe dramatically changes the trajectory for Jaime and Brienne, I still felt that Jaime telling Edmure Tully that he'll essentially murder all of Riverrun to get back to Cersei demonstrated the complexity of his character arc. While we believe he's achieved redemption, there's still these moments that remind us that this is a character that we felt was a villain back in Season 1. And there's issues galore for Season 7 and 8, but there's a certain nostalgia that I get from rewatching these seasons. I remember not noticing the problem so much, as I still had plenty to anticipate the first time watching these episodes each week. We watched so many characters finally encounter other characters that we had been following closely for years, and getting to see how they'd interact with one another was really exciting. It's hard to take the critical lenses off, but I truly do try. Because even Season 8 Game of Thrones reminds me of a really exciting time for the series. Back in 2019, I watched Season 8 with the belief that George R.R. Martin would actually finish his books. So spending the next few years looking at the ending in a playful disgust almost became recreational. But now, as it becomes more and more likely that the books will never have an ending, I do think of the conclusion of Game of Thrones a little differently. I still do not like the ending, but it is a complete story. It was the big game that everyone wanted to talk about Monday morning. It was the hot topic. It did offer something for everyone, and we'll never get to watch it again for the first time, but I would want to be able to experience it all over again blindly more than any other show I've ever seen, even with an ending I know I won't like. And well, I think that's saying something. House of the Dragon is a success for HBO, and I know plenty of people are enjoying it. Dunkin' Egg is coming out soon, and I will watch it. Plus, we have numerous other Game of Thrones spin-off projects as well. But it's not the same. I think of one thing that made Game of Thrones special is that they were adapting a story that the author had not finished. And because of this, they really had to flesh out a general outline for the ending. Now, of course, they made dramatic changes with the source material that they did have, which I don't really like, but being able to deliver an ending that even book fans were not aware of, I think was an advantage. It allowed the entire audience to watch along with no clue how things were going to actually go, and made it so much more exciting because now we have that anticipation. There was something that Game of Thrones captured that I don't know can ever be recreated in any of its spin-offs. There were talks of a Jon SNow sequel, but it looks like those never really came to fruition, and it may be common to hear that we don't want any more from the main series, but if a standalone Season 9 was announced, I have little doubt that it would outperform any other possible spin-off, because it would be like trying to work things out with an ex who you still love. And it might work and it might not, but you know there was something really passionate there before, and who knows, maybe we can right the wrongs from the past. Probably not. But all other spin-offs would be just trying to replace your ex with someone just like them, but it just wouldn't be the same. Deep down, my biggest issue with House of the Dragon is that I've tried to recreate this relationship with someone who's got all these similarities to my ex, but I'm bringing all of my toxic Game of Thrones baggage into it, and it's really just unfair, because even though I know most people have stopped talking about this about 5 years ago, I haven't moved on. And yeah, sure, Game of Thrones really did hurt me, but if I'm being honest, deep down, I do still truly love Game of Thrones.